Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, daily dose of nature. Today's topic, domesticated, from wolves to dogs, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader and wildlife biologist, Aaron Bott. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. This is a subject that I'm really excited to be talking about, and I hope it goes well. There's so much to say, and an hour actually goes by fairly quickly, and I want to make sure that I leave time for our Q&A session at the end. But this, I think, is really a fascinating subject, and a lot of people support my feelings on this. I believe that that's why you're tuning in today, is because you are also interested in the history of dogs and how they relate to wolves and how we got from one wild species to one domesticated species. And so without further ado, let's jump right into it. So by way of introduction, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I work for government agencies, and I'm affiliated with lots of non-government organizations, specifically working with large carnivores. In fact, my job title is wolf biologist, so I study wolves, and I did my graduate research in Yellowstone National Park studying wolves, and I'm currently working on my doctorate, again, studying wolves. So in a nutshell, I'm a dog person. I like dogs. I grew up with dogs. And my fascination with dogs has continued to spill over from my personal life into my professional life. And when I'm not at home, or when I'm not out in the field working with wolves, then I am at home with my best friend, or I should say one of my best friends. This is our family dog. River is her name. She's a German Shepherd. She is almost 7 years old, and she is, one of the best friends that you could ask for. I love having her around. She grew up with my kids. She's a great guardian. She takes really good care of them when they're running out and about in the yard. She's hyper protective. When the mailman comes knocking at our door, she just wants to tear him to pieces, and she feels very accomplished and proud of herself whenever he leaves. I live in a very rural community, so I just walk out my door and I get to take her on a 4-mile hike every morning, or at least that's what I try and do. And it's fun to see her interact with her environment as she runs up and down the trails, and yet when I call her, she comes right back to me. And when we return from our long walk out in the hills, I give her breakfast. She comes over and expects it from me, and I guess what I'm trying to convey to most of you, which I shouldn't have to try and convey very hard, is that we as people have very familial relations with this incredible animal, the domestic dog. And the scenes that I'm describing from my own life, you could probably relate to if you have a dog or if you've ever had a dog. They're caring, they're loyal, they're protective. There's a lot of advantages to having them around, not just for objective labor, but also for personal comfort and for emotional stability. There's a lot of research that's been done on serotonin levels that are boosted in us and oxytocin levels that are boosted in us whenever we have a dog around. And what's fun is this seems to be reciprocal. Dogs also benefit from being around us. So having this really complicated relationship, this really dynamic, and if you think about it, a pretty unusual relationship with an animal is something that has fascinated me, and it's fascinated a lot of people for a long period of time. And because of this, there's a lot of research out there that can help us to try and understand what exactly a domestic dog is and where it came from and how it became domestic. And without further ado, we're going to get into some of those weeds, because I think we take for granted that the dog is man's best friend. There's a lot of dogs out there all over the globe. And if you sit back for just a minute and you think that here is a species, here's an animal that depends upon us, and in many ways we depend upon it, that is an abnormality when you consider all the thousands of other wildlife species that are roaming across the globe. Why is it that the dog is our best friend? Why is it that the dog is so closely associated with us? Why can I pick up the Odyssey? I like classic literature, and one of my favorite passages can be found in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes back home finally after roaming the seas and being gone in the Trojan War for a total of 20 years, and his dog that he grew up with, that's still alive fantastically, comes up and greets him and is happy to see his owner come back after being gone for so long. How is it that I can pick up a story that is thousands of years old and feel like I can relate completely to it as I come home from work and I am embraced with a tail wag and a lick from my own canine companion? There have been a lot of stories in the popular media out and about talking about how dogs have become man's best friend. National Geographic several years ago posted this incredible article on the domestication of dogs. And I really like the photographer's cover photo here of how do you get from a wolf to a woof. Chihuahuas and Shih Tzus and Schnauzers and poodles, etc. All these animals that morphologically look very different from the wolf, which begs the question of is the domestic dog a wolf? And is it not? And how complicated is that relationship? And I also think that it's pertinent to reflect upon the social dynamics of man's best friend and also the stigma that comes from wolves and coexisting with wolves. Man's worst enemy is ironically man's best friend. And what a fascinating social complexity that happens to be. And I get to experience both sides of that story in my life. People really hate wolves and people really love dogs, and yet they share a common ancestor. So I think we need to begin by first defining some important words that we're going to be talking about today. And one of the first things that's really important for us to get across is that tameness is not domestication. What is domestication? Well, tameness is referring to individual submission of an animal. So you can have an animal, and we've seen pictures of this on the internet or occasionally in movies, etc., where you have a bear, a big old grizzly bear or a big brown bear that is taught to do tricks. But bears are not domestic animals. Bears are wild animals. And to have a bear that is habituated to coexisting with a human or with people is a sign of individual submission, where that particular animal has learned to be submissive in the presence of humans. And it will learn to suppress its fear responses to people, which is a natural part of its behavior. And you compare that with the actual definition of domestication, which is referring to genetic modification, where a group of animals has been either naturally or artificially, and we'll get into those two terms in just a second, naturally or artificially selected for over many generations to the point that its actual physiognomy, its inner workings inside its body, operate differently than that of a wild animal's. And again, this is something that's important to realize because we can see that there are, on occasion, lions, for example, in the circus or what have you. Those are not domestic animals. Those are simply tamed animals. And how do we get to the point where we have domestic animals? It's pretty complicated, but it involves a lot of selection for tame attributes. And sometimes this is done consciously, and sometimes this is done unconsciously. And I think this is kind of that linchpin in our discussion today about how wolves became dogs. Did we select for attributes of tameness, or did the species itself adapt to our circumstances, living within our shadow, and therefore tameness was naturally selected for? So this is a perfect caveat right into, or a perfect conduit right into our next topic, which is about evolution. Evolution is a phenomenal subject. And typically when we talk about evolution, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, Charles Darwin, who is often simplistically over celebrated as the person who discovered evolution. And that is not the case. Charles Darwin is a genius, and he really is responsible for advancing biological sciences in ways that no one had ever been able to do beforehand. But he was not arguing that evolution was a new discovery on his part. Evolution had been talked about for generations, actually, prior to Charles Darwin. But what Charles Darwin really brought to light in his book on the origin of species was how evolution was possible. And he's talking about natural selection versus artificial selection. And if you've ever had the opportunity to read On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, you'll realize that he quite brilliantly brings to light a lot of parallels with the natural world versus the artificial world, or the human-dominated world. And he talks a lot about the domestication process of animals to the level of his understanding back in the 19th century, and how that can compare and contrast with natural selection. And these two terms that we're going to be talking about, natural selection and artificial selection, can, I think, be summarized best by Darwin himself when he says from his book, "Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends." So natural selection is an evolutionary process where consciously or subconsciously, population is selecting for traits that increase the overall fitness of the species. Artificial selection is when people get involved and we begin to select for different attributes that most benefit ourselves. And the domestication of the dog involves a little bit of both natural selection as well as artificial selection. Domestication itself, as we've already discussed, is defined by a set of genetic modifications within a wild animal population until they basically become reliant and dependent upon us, and we also become dependent upon those animals. This, I think, is, again, grossly underappreciated by people because we've been doing this for thousands of years. But as the author and scientist Jared Diamond points out in his book on guns, germs, and steel, the domestication, the original concept of domesticating a wild animal is earth-shattering. It's quite groundbreaking in terms of what we were able to accomplish as a species after domestication took place. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived on the earth in the shadow of other animals that were stronger than us, faster than us, better at hunting than us, more capable in many ways than we are at doing certain things. And very often we're familiar with like the idea of adopting a totemic spirit animal, or this notion of, boy, if I could transform into a bird and if I could fly, what a wonder that would be. Or if I could hunt as efficiently as a lion or a tiger, what a marvel that would be. This kind of this transformative, magical, almost occult sort of ideal, I think, is something that we as humans have always been fascinated with. But at some point in time, humans were able to actually harness the power of animals for our own benefit. And that kind of technology has shaped the rest of human history. And again, how wild is it to see something like a hawk that is able to soar above the trees and to go over the sage and the grasses and to hunt efficiently. what a marvel it is to then cultivate tameness in a hawk or a falcon, and to have an animal like that go out and do that hunting for you, and to bring back a coney, or to bring back a ground squirrel that you're then able to consume. Or the fact that you have meat that you can readily produce through the domestication process of having animals basically at your table year round. So this idea that domestication can provide food that is readily available for people, as well as labor, the power of animals is so much greater than humans, generally speaking. You can have clothing, you can have things like wool or animal skins that are produced for a species like ourselves, which are naked and basically restricted to areas where the ambient temperature is in the 70s. And then, of course, transportation, the endurance and stamina and power of animals like the horse that can transport us now beyond the limited distance of 20 miles a day to 40 to 60 miles a day is really something that is incredible. So again, it's vital to this topic today for us to appreciate just how revolutionary the domestication of animals has been for our species, and how much we as a species have depended upon the powers of other animals in order to be successful. And very often we can see that this biotechnology has been a deciding factor in the rise and fall of civilizations. You've got everything from the Norman conquest to the Assyrians to the Egyptians to the Shoshone Indians getting the horse before the Blackfeet, and how the tables turn when animals are cultivated on one side rather than another side, and how that can influence, again, the spread, the rapidity of the spread of a civilization, and ultimately the fall in some other civilizations. This is a powerful quote taken from Cortez during the conquistadors and their expansion into the Americas. And what a terrible time that was. And this quote that he says, "After God, we owe our victory to the horses." Again, I think that summarizes the power of having this biotechnology and just how great it ultimately was in shaping the course of human history. So now if we've established that, if we've gotten it into our heads that this domestication thing is something that's pretty serious, something that we ought to truly come to appreciate and not take for granted. I think what's fascinating next is to look at the animals that we have domesticated. And the 5 most important, economically important species that we have on the face of the earth today are sheep, goats, cows, horses, and pigs, which were all domesticated between 4,000 and 8,000, perhaps 10,000 years ago. And most of these were domesticated in and around the Fertile Crescent, with the perhaps exception of the pig, which might have been domesticated in China. But these animals, again, they really shape our lives today. Even as we've moved into this 21st century, we still greatly depend upon them for their power, their products, their meat, their milk, and their symbolism in our cultures today. But what I think is most fascinating is we look at these animals, which are all herbivores, and we consider just how long we've had them. We've domesticated them and lived with them. And you take that into consideration of when the dog was domesticated, which was estimated to be 16 to 35, 32,000 years ago. That's so much further back than the time that we domesticated these other herbivores that are significantly and economically important to us. Isn't that wild that the dog was the first domesticated species before we began domesticating plants, even well before we began domesticating other animals that we're familiar with? It's the domestication of the dog which began first, and not just a few thousand years, but many thousands of years before the domestication of these other species. How did we get to this point? How did we get to a point where the first animal which we domesticated was a carnivore, I think that's something that's interesting to discuss and to hypothesize over. It's easy to understand why domesticating an herbivore would be beneficial to early humans, because these herbivores can convert material that is useless to humans into resources that are very beneficial to humans, namely vegetation, right? You grow a cow, it eats grass that is otherwise worthless to people, and it converts that grass into milk and into meat, and humans can then harvest that meat so that they can subsist off of it. That's a pretty pragmatic way of existing. But dogs are carnivores, and the fact that dogs have to eat meat over many years and they don't get very big shows the system, I guess, would be backwards. If you're feeding a dog more meat than it's actually going to provide in order for you to consume the dog, it just doesn't work that way. And while it's true, eventually some societies did adopt dogs as a form of consumption, as a product to eat. It wasn't really until the agricultural revolution took way and we had enough refuse from other byproducts of our agricultural society that we were able to actually cultivate dogs for a food resource. So for thousands of years ago, we had them as our companions, but in order for them to be justified as our companions, they had to provide other services to us. And we're going to look at what some of those other services might have been in order for this domestication process to have actually unfolded. And I know that there's probably some cat lovers tuned in today. And so just for a little statement, if you're curious, the domestication of the cat, if it arguably ever was domesticated, I grew up with a cat and they're pretty independent, took place about 10,000 years ago. So again, the dog was well before the cats were ever domesticated. So why the dog? Why did we start with dogs? What makes them, or canines, I should say, because they eventually became the dog, but why the canines? Why do we have canine companions instead of lemur companions, or perhaps primate companions, or something else that seems like it might do well coexisting with us? Well, one of the most interesting facts about the genetics and the genotyping of dogs and wolves is they overlap in their DNA quite substantially. 99.9% of a wolf's DNA is also a Chihuahua's DNA. Isn't that wild to think about? The fact that these animals are so similar that as scientists, we classify the wolf as Canis lupus, and we classify the dog as Canis lupus subspecies familiaris, the familiar wolf. And how is it that you can possibly have such diversity in morphology in the breeds when you compare the familiar wolf and what it looks like? And how is it possible that these genes or the DNA can be so much of a match, and yet again they look differently and they can behave so differently? So to answer this, we're going to jump back in time and we're going to look at the order Carnivora. This is a group of animals that all evolved basically to consume meat, and they have special physical adaptations that help them to consume meat efficiently. A couple weeks ago, I gave a presentation on foraging, on eating, and one of the best ways for a species to get nutrients is for it to eat meat. Meat is very digestible. It only takes a simple monogastric system like ourselves. We've got a monogastric system that you can very quickly and very readily extract the nutrients that your body needs and convert it into energy so that you can grow and develop from consuming meat. But the tricky part is meat doesn't usually want to get caught and eaten. And so you have to begin to adapt to your prey base, and you have to try and figure out, evolutionarily speaking, how you can most efficiently hunt and catch your prey. And evolution has come up with a whole bunch of ways that animals have evolved to catching their prey for consumption. And these species that I have on my slide in front of me are just some of the ways that evolution has come up with solutions to resolve this problem. The most popular carnivores probably being the cats with their supinating wrists and their retractable claws. They're ambush predators. They've got short snouts, very powerful bites, razor sharp claws, just really efficient hunting and killing machines when it comes to consuming meat. They are truly apex predators. But then on the other side of the order of the carnivores, you have the canids, and they are right here. So the canids, or the dogs, have some very interesting morphological adaptations to help them catch their dinners, and also some traits that make them pretty unique. So they have at the back of their skull this auditory bully, which is a physical adaptation which influences their hearing in distinct ways that separates them from the felids. They also have these specialized teeth. So all carnivores have what are known as carnassials, and you can see it from the lateral view of this mandible, this jaw right here. Carnassials are razor sharp, scissor-like teeth that cut meat. But unlike the cats, which are truly obligate carnivores, canids have what are known as a talonid on their carnassial, or their back molars. You can see right here, it's flat, kind of like our molars. And this allows them to be more adaptive in their diet. So if they can't catch and consume meat, then they can consume things other than meat in order to get some nutrients. Wolves occasionally will eat berries, for example. And I think it's a telltale sign that domestic dogs, as many of us are familiar, eat dog food, which has some grains in it as well. And they have these elongated rostrums, or snouts, and this is really essential for making the animal what it is. These long snouts allow wolves or dogs to travel for great distances, circulating oxygen, which is coming in through their nose and then cooling their internal organs before going out of their body, being expelled from their body. And it's the self-heating regulatory system which allows canids to move great distances. So most of us are familiar with cats being ambush predators. Well, wolves are cursorial predators. They chase their prey down, and they can move great distances when they're out hunting. And one of the reasons why they can do this is because of their elongated snouts. And also their elongated snouts give them incredible olfactory capabilities. They can smell very, very well. And I don't need to go into that because that's kind of their reputation. Now, because the canid family is so highly adaptive, they've actually had a tremendous geographic range across particularly the northern hemisphere. And this map that I have posted up above is the historical and the current distribution of Canis lupus, or the wolf. Once upon a time, essentially, you could find wolves anywhere in the northern hemisphere, which is remarkable. They have the greatest terrestrial distribution of any animal on the planet, with the exception of people. And it's their adaptability, their ability to move, to be generalists, that allows them to live from the Arctic all the way down to the deserts. And because of this huge distribution and range, it's no wonder, perhaps, that humans first began to associate with them and to recognize them and to coexist with them. For 400,000 years, humans have coexisted with wolves. 400,000 years. As we left Africa and as we began to spread across Eurasia and eventually into North America and down through South America and down into Australia, etc., we have often come across these very dynamic canids, which were not always the top dogs. We consider them to be apex predators today, but it's important to realize that during the Pleistocene and before the Pleistocene, or the Ice Age, wolves were basically medium-sized predators. There were a lot of other large carnivores on the landscape that they had to compete with. saber-toothed cats, as well as large diverse bear species, larger canid species, dog bears, which are now extinct. And what really gives the wolf the advantage over a lot of these other species is, again, its willingness and its ability to adapt to its environment, as well as its social organization. Because wolves are so dependent as a social species, they're so gregarious and they depend so completely upon what's called a cooperative breeding unit. They're able to overcome tasks which an individual wolf might not be able to do on its own. And I think that this impressed us. In fact, I guarantee you that it impressed us as a species. And without getting into the details about who influenced whom, I think that is, again, almost no wonder that we as humans that live basically in a simplistic nuclear family unit would gravitate towards wolves that also do something very similar. So sharing so much common history and having such a great expansive range, again, it's far wonder that humans would not continuously encounter wolves as they traveled and navigated the world. And as they did so, they probably were followed by wolves, and they probably encountered wolves. They probably killed wolves, and occasionally were probably killed by wolves. So they had this very dynamic relationship. But this brings us to the question of, are dogs wolves? Is this where the story basically begins and ends? Did people just come across wolves and then pick up some wolf pups and raise them on their own? Did wolves kind of just come into the light of our campfires and lay down at our feet, and some of them wanted to be friends with us while others did not? This, I think, again, is where the story begins to become more complicated, and it's not quite as simplistic as some people might believe. But it's most universally agreed upon today that because they share the same DNA, wolves and dogs are very similar to a degree, but obviously they're very different to many other degrees. And most biologists agree today that the domestic dog, originated from a subspecies of the wolf that is perhaps now extinct. This subspecies or ecological variant of Canis lupus showed traits of being tame or less xenophobic, neophobic of humans than their counterparts, Canis lupus, which we would recognize today. Now, I think that it's important, again, for me to perhaps clarify on some terminology. So we have species, we have a genus, which is the family, a group, if you will, it's like the surname. And then you have the specific species, and then you have a subspecies. And subspecies are groups of animals that show some subtle, distinct genetic or morphological qualities, which make them a little bit more unique. And some biologists are kind of wary of expressing favor of subspecies. They don't like to split animals into different categories because things start to get muddy. And with an animal as adaptive as the wolf, for example, it might be even unnecessary. But it's pretty well agreed upon, again, that the ancestor, the forebear of the domestic dog today, was essentially a wolf, Canis lupus, although it expressed some, perhaps, some favoritism towards living in the shadow of humans. And how did this come about? Well, there's some popular speculation about how ultimately the wolf, or this subspecies, this ecological variant of the wolf, was ultimately domesticated. One of the most popular and well-known theories out there is individual-based selection, which is the argument that humans essentially took wolf pups and raised them by hand, and the ones that showed the most inclination for being submissive and tame were then kept, and over many generations, we had the result of a domestic dog species or subspecies that was dependent upon us. There's some pretty big criticisms with this theory, though. One is it doesn't seem likely that we would go out and we would collect wolf pups and then have the foresight or the imagination that raising them would perhaps be beneficial to us. Another theory out there is population-based selection, which I think has some more substantial value to it than individual-based selection. So population-based selection is this idea that as humans, for example, would travel in a nomadic way across the landscape, they would leave behind refuse. They'd leave behind gut piles from animals that they had hunted. They'd leave behind refuse and garbage, meat and bones, basically from camps. And it's easier to scavenge than to hunt. And wolves, again, being highly dynamic, basically would creep up to areas that we had recently abandoned, and they would forage off of our refuse. And scavenging became part of the identity of, again, this ecological variant of the wolf. As they became more familiar with humans, they recognized humans as a source for food, not necessarily as food, but as a resource for food. You began to develop some genetic modifications that help them overcome their neophobic responses to humans. Then there's human-dog co-evolution theory, which basically argues that humans and dogs co-evolved. We both were hypersocial animals on the landscape, and we always lived within one another's shadow. And because we always lived within one another's shadow, we began to evolve different physical characteristics in response to our needs and in response to the physical characteristics of our canine companions. For example, one extreme theory would be that dogs evolved to have long noses, and therefore we didn't need long noses because we've always been around dogs. So we have shorter faces, and our olfactory capabilities are not quite as accurate or as acute as a canine's would be because we always had our canine companions with us. This theory is pretty weak, and it doesn't have a lot of general support from the scientific community. But I think it's important to bring up here because very often we talk about human-dog coevolution, and perhaps we oversimplify exactly what that coevolution statement means. Because clearly we have helped one another adapt to our different circumstances and our environments. That coevolution in the sense that we're talking about here is a little bit more complicated, and therefore this theory is a lot less likely. And then we have human group selection, where different tribes of people or nomadic families working out on the landscape recognize the advantages quickly on for having wolves be companions, which kind of ties in with our last theory, which is pretty well supported, that having canines, having wolves as our companions was always beneficial, but ultimately through cultural and technological evolution, they began to adapt with us to our own environments. So this is kind of a complicated way of saying that there's a lot of different theories out there about how dogs came to be from wolves, how we began to coexist. But I think the basic point that most people agree upon, and this is very fascinating, is that dogs in part became dogs because they domesticated themselves. And this is known as commensal pathway domestication. So commensalism in wildlife biology refers to when one particular animal benefits from being in the presence of another animal without any negative repercussions, or even perhaps any beneficial repercussions to begin with. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the most agreed upon theories is this notion that as people began to hunt in tribes and in groups, we would bring down large prey, and we would leave behind a lot of refuse, a lot of gut piles. Our camps would leave a lot of refuse and garbage behind. And wolves, being highly dynamic, very adaptable, they began to domesticate themselves by following in our shadow, by basically losing that innate sense of fear and recognizing that humans could be advantageous to them, if perhaps not the other way around at first. And where this began to take place is really hotly debated. It took place in Eurasia. It's about as accurate as anyone could possibly give you an idea. For a long time, there was arguments supporting the domestication of dogs in what is now modern day China, and then it kind of expanded to more Eastern Asia. And now we've got some other sites, specifically around Germany, so in Western Europe, that are again kind of breaking down the paradigms of where perhaps this took place. And there's also the question of if commensal pathway domestication was exactly how wolves first became domesticated. Did it happen independently at several sites throughout thousands of years? Did this happen multiple times? Or was there just one domestication event that took place? Again, this is really hard to figure out, and without getting too much into the weeds, I will say that right now the current scientific consensus is that domestication took place perhaps just once, and with, again, wolves turning into dogs and becoming so highly adaptive and benefiting humans to such a degree, it's likely that the domestication of dogs quickly became a commodity, and peoples began to not only travel with their canine companions, but also trade their canine companions with other people. And dogs / wolves are highly prolific, and so as they dispersed, this new biotechnology kind of swept across Eurasia. I'm not going to get into this in this lecture because of today's limited time, but another argument for humanity's expansion into North America, its successful expansion into North America between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, is because they brought with them canines, they brought with them dogs, which supported the survivorship of humans. Humans have been coming into North America between 15 and 20,000 years ago is kind of the current consensus. But there's not a lot of evidence that they were able to persist in the New World. And it wasn't really until between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago that they started to bring their canine companions with them, which really helped them to, again, persist tenaciously in the New World. Now, for a long time, people have been, as we've just established, coexisting with dogs, with wolves. And for a long time, we've been finding archaeological evidence to support that humans have had a very particularly unique relationship with these animals. And in the 1970s, we first began to document and age some of these burial sites. Some of the earliest were found back in Israel and were dated back to 12,000 years ago. But that has since been pushed back. We were thinking, boy, we've got dog burial sites that are 12,000 years old, and now we've gone back even further and we found dozens of dog burial sites, these very intricate ritual funeral kind of processions that took place, these ceremonies that took place all across Eurasia and then again into the New World, where canine companions were ceremoniously buried with honor and with reverence, which I think is a telltale sign of domestication to a certain degree. But things become complicated when you go back too far. And let me explain, because I think that this is maybe going to help clarify why we don't exactly have a date for when dogs became domesticated. If you find a burial site, for example, where someone died with a dog, or perhaps there's a dog that has been buried, how do you know that it's a dog and not just a wolf? And can't you just answer the question of domestication by looking at the genes of that individual animal? Well, a perfect example of this would be dog ore, which is a photograph or here's a photograph of Dagor, a 2-month-old puppy taken from Siberia. It's been documented to be almost 19,000 years old, and it was buried along with some people. But Dagor is the name that was given to it by the scientists who discovered it. In the local language of the peoples where it was found, Dagor refers to, or can be translated to friend, but it's also a play on words because it could be a dog or it could be a wolf pup. It's really difficult to tell, and the reason why it's difficult to tell is because dogs are too wolf-like to be distinguished from wolves before 15,000 years ago. Now, let me see if I can jump ahead a couple slides, actually. Actually, I'll go back, stay in order here. But during the process of domestication, it's important to realize that these animals behaved, or they adapted and evolved through adaptive selection or perhaps natural selection to change behaviorally before they began to change morphologically. So their physical traits, their physical selves would have been identifiable as a wolf. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a prehistoric dog and a wolf just by sight. The size of the skeleton, the muscles, the tissue, and of course, as we've looked at the DNA, we understand that the DNA of these canine companions, as I'll call them, were essentially wolves. And so for thousands of years, our dogs, quote unquote, looked exactly like wolves. And in many ways, they behaved a lot like wolves. And genetically, with their DNA, they basically are wolves, 99.9%. So as soon as you start going back further in time, it becomes really difficult for us to try and figure out when wolves actually transformed and became something that was more distinct. The oldest indisputed domestic dog is dated to 14,700 years ago. So about 15,000 years ago, we start to see physical traits, physical characteristics changing in the dog. And we begin to identify, again, morphological adaptations of domestication rather than just behavioral domestications. And because I'm getting short on time here, I'm going to have to skip through a few things, but this kind of goes to show that as we began to coexist with these canines that were essentially wolves, their behavioral traits began to shift and they began to depend more upon us and we began to depend more upon them. And as this relationship grew, in some cases our reverence for this animal grew too, and we can find lots of archaeological evidence of burial sites where these animals were revered, not just for comfort, but perhaps for vigilance and protecting us from other hostile peoples or animals. They helped us to hunt. There's a lot of advantages of keeping this carnivore around, even at the expense of us sharing some of our well-earned resources with these animals. Now, things began to shift for humanity about 12 to 15,000 years ago when people began to establish more permanent villages and we began to adopt some agrarian practices. And this is where domestication took another turn. So no longer are we just selecting through natural selection, through commensal pathway of domestication. Not only are we noticing some tame characteristics, some behavioral patterns changing among dogs, but as soon as we establish permanent villages and settlements, suddenly we have physical barriers that separate wild wolves with, for lack of a better term, domestic wolves. And when we begin to do this, it's when we start to have bottlenecking in sorts. In the gene pool becomes more limited and you start to see more variation in the physical manifestations of domestication. And one noticeable trait that we can actually look for when we do genetic analysis on canine remains is wolves lack a digestive enzyme known as AMY B2, there we go, yeah, AMYB2, which helps them to digest for more starchy resources. And our domestic dogs have this enzyme, and they developed it through cohabitation with people as they ate not only our meat refuse, but also grains that were thrown out and left to them as well. And really, between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, it's when humans begin to select dogs for various working roles, which results in breeding. So we begin to select different, really generate different breeds of dogs in order to perform various traits to help us with shepherding, to help us with hunting, or even to help us with aesthetics in some case. Now, something that's interesting is as we begin to select for these behavioral and physical traits more consciously, we begin to notice that there's some pedomorphic characteristic retention in dogs versus wolves. And pedomorphic is a complicated word of just saying dogs tend to retain juvenile traits, whereas wolves retain the full suite of mature characteristics that it could possibly be exposed to. So we see things like curly tails showing up, which curly tails and floppy ears are traits of a juvenile wolf. Things like barking and whining and tail wagging, as well as a diminished overall physical size, are all parts of pedomorphic characteristic retention. So it's kind of oversimplistic to say this, but basically dogs are retarded in their ultimate development, where they retain more juvenilistic characters, whereas a wolf inherits a full suite of opportunities to become an independent individual. I'm conscious that I'm getting low on time, guys. I'm sorry. This has been taking longer than I thought. I was afraid this would happen. Now, I want to skip forward a lot of years to a very famous Russian fox experiment, which took place beginning in the 1950s and exposed domestication and what it possibly would mean to the world through a process known as destabilizing selection theory. If you're not familiar with this study, it is really, really thorough. It's been going on for over 40 years. It's kind of wrapped up about now. And I will say this too, that in recent years, the study has come under fire from certain observations in the scientific community. So all of the claims that were made are not perhaps validated, but some things that we learned from this Russian fox experiment is that hormones are one of the first things to go in destabilizing basically the overall development of a canine or any other animal before we begin to notice the genes expressing different behavioral traits and characteristics. So hormones within our body, they act as chemical receptors which turn adaptations off and on, and they help us to basically navigate our environments. And when we start to select for different, artificially or naturally, for different types of attributes for tameness, what's going on inside the body of the animal is the hormones are basically destabilized. And this can change the reproductive cycle of animals. For example, wolves only breed one time a year, whereas dogs typically breed twice a year. So the hormones go out of sync, which then influences the overall behavior of the animal, which subsequently and eventually results in changing the morphology of the animal or the physical appearance of the animal. And this is something that is essential to understand, because a modification is not a divergence in the gene pool, which helps us to understand how you can have a Chihuahua, which has essentially got the same DNA as a wolf. So these modifications, again, are not separations within the genetic codes. The DNA can remain the same, but they can be modified to such an extreme degree that you can have a 3-pound animal be akin to a 100-pound wild animal. It's also important to understand that introgression is always possible. So within the canine genus, canines are capable of reproducing with other canines on the landscape. So although we began to domesticate dogs, although we had domestic dogs, that doesn't mean that there wasn't introgression taking place. And one perfect example of this is if you're familiar with the Yellowstone wolves. Wolves in Yellowstone are about 50% black and 50% gray. And we've recently, in the last 12 years, discovered that black wolves have a special genome called the K-locus gene, which can be traced back to introgressive breeding with domestic dogs that prehistoric peoples brought with them into North America. And as prehistoric dogs bred with wolves, they passed this genome back into the wolf population. So really here in North America, we can see an example of this introgressive phenotypic expression. Now, how old are dog breeds? I'm just wrapping this up. There's a lot of dog breeds out there today, and some dog breeds claim to be very, very old, including these two. But more often than not, there's a misunderstanding in just how old dog breeds are. You would think that the further back you go, the more wolf-like your dog breeds would go or would look. So it might be, some people might think that like German Shepherds or the Huskies are very old dog breeds because they look like wolves, but actually they're relatively new dog breeds. In fact, German Shepherds are a very new dog breed. And this is all based off of coincidental convergent selection. So at certain times, we have, for example, at the top here, the Basenji, I might have pronounced that wrong. The Basenji dog breed has often been dubbed the oldest dog breed in the world. And we know that that in the times of the Pharaoh, there was a dog that looked very similar to this. But scientific and genetic research has showed that some of these old dog breeds have actually all died out. And just through the mixing and muddling of different populations, the mutts essentially have prevailed. And so most dog breeds, which we claim to be very old, are not in fact old. They're just a reemergence of a specific, again, morphological set of characteristics that have been hidden in the genes for a long time. The rest really is history. I'm out of time, so I'm going to just wrap up by saying that because of dogs, we've depended upon dogs for thousands of years. I mean, in North America, what a perfect example where we didn't have the domestic horse until the Spanish expansion into the Americas took place in the 1500s. And until that time, the dog was the only domestic animal that we had in North America up until that time. And the peoples depended upon it for transportation as well as food, as well as hunting. And as we, again, co-evolved, I'll use that phrase kind of out of place here, but as we co-evolved with this specific animal, we generated different breeds to fulfill different kinds of work, different kinds of labors that we ourselves were not capable of doing. And we have established a long-lasting relationship. Breeding for dog show for aesthetic value only really took place in the Victorian era, so the mid-19th century. The first kennel club was started in 1873 in the UK, and now we've got kennel clubs all over the world. And because of artificial selection, because of inbreeding, because of trying to generate dogs with pure aesthetic value, we now have 400, even more than 500 recognized dog breeds, which just goes to show the power of adopting certain kinds of genomes and turning certain hormonal switches off and on can do and can result in. But ultimately, and in conclusion, I want to say thanks for tuning in for my talk. There's a lot of information, perhaps too much for one presentation. It would be good to revisit this again someday. But here we are. This is a picture of my boy with my dog out on a walk. Man's best friend. I just think it's so fascinating that when I want to deflate my ego, I say I'm not a wolf biologist. I just study wild dogs out in the landscape, because there really is a lot of wolf still in the dog, and there's to some degree some dog in the wolf too. I think it's a fascinating, complicated relationship which has truly influenced our society today. Over the millennia, we've become who we are because of our relationship with this remarkable animal. And I know that it's past 2 o'clock, but I have plenty of time to take questions, so I'll leave it up to the host. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Now, before we start in with some of these questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit a question via the question field in the control panel. So let me ask you this, Aaron. Where does the coyote fit in?
Good question. So the coyote shares about a 96% DNA overlap with the wolf, Canis lupus. So the coyote evolved here. Let me step back even a little bit further. The canine genus originated in North America. And then through biotic interchange over tens of thousands of years, the canines expanded across the Bering Land Bridge into what we now call the Old World, into Eurasia. And there, the progenitor to the wolf evolved and became the wolf that we recognize today. Meanwhile, its distant cousin remained here in North America and evolved into what we recognize as the coyote today. So the wolf and the coyote share a 96% genetic overlap, or DNA overlap, which is the same as a human and an orangutan, to put that into perspective. I should bring up too that in Darwin's book on the origin of species, he speculated that perhaps the domestic dog had originated from the jackal. And people often see similarities between the coyote and the jackal, but we've since, through thorough investigation of DNA, molecular observations, mitochondrial DNA research, we know that the wolf was the progenitor to the domestic dog. So coyotes are out there closely related to the dog, i.e. the wolf, but not domestic.
So is it fair to say that dogs don't have 96% genome shared with coyotes?
Yeah, yep, that would be safe to say. But they can breed together. They can breed together. All canines can breed together and produce fertile offspring.
And can coyotes be domesticated?
There's been a lot of research, specifically with my professor, looking into that. No doubt they probably could. So successfully, we have domesticated foxes, as I briefly discussed in this presentation today. But even that took about 35 to 40 generations of fox in order for us to reach the point where we could efficiently and pragmatically refer to them as being domestic. So hypothetically, yeah, you probably could, because they're more closely related to the wolf than the fox, much more closely related to the wolf than the fox. So yeah, in theory, you probably could.
Is there any benefit, or is it even a good idea to crossbreed wolves and dogs nowadays?
No, it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible, terrible idea. And I'll tell you why. Because again, before you have physical characteristics change, the first things that begin to change during domestication process is your behavior, right? Behavioral traits. Dogs have so long been removed from the wolf that they are completely submissive and tame to humans. Wolves, which have never undergone domestication, are always striving to be independent. So people, when they get wolf hybrid dogs or wolf dogs as pets, it's a terrible idea because they don't have the tameness bred into them. So there's always the option, or there's always the risk that your pet might try and supplant you and become the dominant. So it's very risky to have around children. Does it happen? Can it, can each case is individually specific. So in some cases there are no problems, but it's too risky, and I really discourage anyone from getting wolf dog hybrids or from crossing them. So
Are there any non-domesticated canids in the southern hemispheres?
yes, there are. So you have African wild dogs in Africa. I didn't. Those are a canid that essentially lives and behaves like wolves. They're a cooperative breeding species. I didn't have time to talk about this today, but this would be another fascinating subject. Dingoes are domestic dogs gone feral. About 5,000 years ago, people migrating into the Australian continent brought with them their domestic dogs, and those domestic dogs for the last 5,000 years have adapted to the Australian continent and are now considered wild. But there's, again, that's introgression, right? So you had a wolf become a dog, and then a dog essentially go back to being a wolf. It's very Call of the Wild-esque. I'm sure Jack London would appreciate that if he had known the genetics of that story during his day.
So then are feral dogs still considered domesticated in that case?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really important to understand too, especially if you are interested in wild horses. So the wild horses that we have here in North America are still domestic horses. Wild is simply a legal definition. Feral, in the case of wild horses, I should say, wild horses is a legal definition referring to their lack of ownership. But you could argue that they're feral, just like feral dogs. In fact, 70 to 80% of the domestic dogs on the planet are feral. That's a lot. It's a lot of dogs that don't have owners that are running around. They are not wild. They've been domesticated. It might have been generations and generations and generations ago that they were living with people, but they still have the morphological changes and the behavioral changes in them.
Well, thank you, Aaron. But unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, maybe I bit off a little bit more than I could chew. I was overambitious. This is such a fascinating subject. I hope that I answered some of your questions, if you had some, before you began watching. But I think, again, it's important to realize that animals are very intelligent and adaptable. And I like the idea that we need them as much as they need us when it comes to domestication. And the idea of behavioral changes before physical changes, I hope sticks with you. And I also hope you get the chance to go out and take your dog for a walk today. Or if you don't have a dog, go down to the nearest animal shelter and take a dog for a walk. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.